So my wife was watching the video I made on creativity and she said, yes, that's nice, dear, which is very sweet. But she said what she really liked was the discussions that we'd had on genetics, learning and the philosophy of science. She said what you really ought to do is make a video on that. So if you want somebody to blame for this particular video, then I guess you could blame her. Now, a warning, it is a talking head video again, so if you don't like talking head videos, then please feel free to switch off. And I'm going to put some caveats at the beginning here, because some people will start to watch it and then either get bored or disagree violently with what I'm saying and feel that they really ought to make a comment and ought to put a dislike. And by all means do if that's how you feel, but a few caveats. These are just my ideas. In them, there are contradictions, and I understand that. There are plenty of contradictions in life, and the problem with contradictions is not overcoming them or reconciling them, it's just learning to live with them. We have contradiction all the time, and in fact, there is absolutely nothing wrong with holding contradictory opinions. You just have to learn to reconcile them, really, or rather, you have to learn to live with them, and that's all you have to do. You certainly don't have to excuse your contradictions or be apologetic for them. There are plenty of times you have them. Just live with them, get people to accept you for who you are rather than trying to make them into what they are. So there will be contradictions in what I say, I'm fine with that. Now, there is a bit of philosophy in here, but it's meant to be a sort of homespun moral guidance kind of thing. It's not meant to be a worked out system of philosophy. So all those people who want to come back to me on semantics, the use of symbols and the meaning of words and the meaning of those symbols and how we convey messages to each other and whether if a tree falls in the woods, if nobody's there to hear it, does it really fall? All that kind of crap, I have no interest in. So there's no real point in trying to engage me in those kind of philosophical discussions where you go in the ins and outs and whether it has to be logically true to the end and whether I'm catching myself in my own contradictions. I very probably am, it very probably isn't logically true, and I very probably just don't give a damn. So feel free with those caveats in mind to make comments and contribute, by all means do. So I suppose the preamble over, the first thing to do really is consider genetics. What are the genes and what role do they play? Now we're told that the gene is the fundamental key of life. Without the gene we wouldn't exist. We couldn't possibly have the body shape. The gene contains all the information needed to make us us. And to a degree, of course, that's very true. The gene does have a role to play in the forming of the body and in certain other aspects of our development as well. But we're led to believe that the gene is fundamental to the role of our development. Now, I just don't believe that. There are lots of reasons why I don't believe that, but there is a very good example. And if you think about thalidomide, now thalidomide was a drug given to pregnant women, certainly in the UK, I think the US, I'm not sure, but certainly the UK. Now, all it actually did was change the environment in the womb. So the drug got into the womb and changed the chemical makeup of the womb. It didn't destroy the genes of the fetus. So the baby, as it grew, had the same genes as the normal parent. These weren't changed. But when the babies were actually born, they were born without legs and arms. So it begs the question, what actually happened there? Because in theory, the growth of our legs and arms is supposed to be controlled by the genes. But introduce something like thalidomide into the womb environment, and clearly it has a drastic impact on the actual development of the body. So the genes in themselves cannot control the shape that we develop. Obviously from that little horrible example, incidentally, but obviously from that horrible example, it's the womb environment that has a big control over the development of a person. Now, that womb environment is itself cross-checked by the genes, certainly. But if you make a big change to that environment, you're going to make a big change to the baby when it's born. And that tells you something quite fundamental about the role in the gene. The role of the gene is to help create the environment, but it is the environment, really, that dictates the shape of the body. And this has been done in other experiments too. I mean, scientists are crazy fellas sometimes. Thorndike was infamous for, and this is another horrible example, he was infamous for plucking the eyeballs out of cats, turning the eyes upside down and popping them back in there, and then seeing what happened. Because the cats went crazy. Who wouldn't go crazy if you were flipping your eyeballs upside down? But scientists do these kind of things. And one thing that they did was they took the fetus of a sheep and put it into a goat. And what was born was kind of half goat, half sheep. So again, the womb environment is actually having a huge impact on the makeup of the creature that's been born. Now, of course, this raises an argument that's been raging for hundreds of years in science, and it's called the nature-nurture debate. What the nature-nurture debate is all about is about which element of you is controlled by the genes and which element of you is controlled by the environment. And it has been an enormous argument. It fills volumes of books in any library. It has spin-offs in things like sociobiology, which had a brief flirtation with popularity about 20 years ago. And all of this thing continues to roll on now. What is it that the genes control? What is it that the environment controls? Now, the only possible outcome of that is that some things are controlled by the genes and some things are controlled by the environment. And that's the only valuable contribution about 200 years of argument has actually made. It's quite funny, really. Now, when you're thinking about what I've just said about the body being controlled by the environment in which it's in, it does raise a number of questions about the degree of control that the genes could possibly have. Now, I don't mean to go into those arguments because they're old and dry and dusty and well worn out. What I want to do is propose an idea and then look at that idea in terms of genetics and learning. Now, let's say that an intelligent creature is able to move into the environment and change its behaviour in terms of what it meets in that environment. Or to put it another way, an intelligent creature is intelligent because it can map its behaviour to the contours of the environment in which it finds itself. And let's take that as a proposition. Now, I don't want to particularly argue that proposition because it's a straightforward proposition. I'm just saying that's the way I see things. Now, if that's the case, then the development of the baby in the womb that we talked about with thalidomide actually becomes an exercise in learning, because here we have a biological intelligent creature, here we have changed the environment, and the result of mapping itself onto that environment is the loss of arms and legs. So that growth development then becomes an act of learning, if learning is mapping your behaviour to the contours of your environment. Okay? Now that's actually the way I see it. What that means is that everything is learnt. So you learn your body shape. You learn just about everything from the environment in which you find yourself. Now, this doesn't only have corollaries in terms of the physical shape that you have. There have been plenty of occasions when you find the famous wild boys of Avignon, where children have been lost in the woods and raised by wolves. It has actually happened. Or where they find children who've been locked under the stairs for the last 20 years, again, something that has actually happened. And they find that without stimulation, without an environment in which to interact, then these creatures become actual relative morons. Now, that's a hard way of putting something, but we all know that in order to create an intelligent baby, you have to stimulate it. Stimulation, an environment in which the intelligent creature can interact, is actually essential to the intelligence of the creature. So if your environment is very limited, then your thought processes are going to be very limited too. If your environment is very stimulating, equally, your thought processes are going to be very stimulating too. And we have hinted at this in previous videos on creativity, where I said that if you find yourself in a creative environment, you find yourself becoming more creative. That's very true. But that's because your environment is stimulating in itself, and you as an intelligent creature are able to map your behaviour to that environment in which you find yourself, and you find that creative muscle getting stronger. You find yourself becoming more creative because of the environment in which you found yourself and because you're an intelligent creature. So this has a huge impact on the kind of people, the kind of world that you associate with. Now, I don't know how many people are particularly au fait with physiotherapy. But if something happens like a stroke, which is a cerebrovascular accident, a blood clot kills part of your brain, you lose all motor function in the opposite side. So if you have a stroke in your right-hand side, you'll lose your motor function in your left-hand side. In order to work on that, what the physiotherapists use is something called the bow bath technique. And that sounds cool. What it is rolling people around on big red rubber balloons. And you would think that was really weird. But it isn't. Because we learn first through movement. That is the interaction of our body with the environment in a physical kind of way. We progress from that, and that's called a kinesthetic technique, incidentally. We progress from kinesthetic to audiovisual. And that progression happens in the brain because you are making the links through physical contact with your environment. Now that's really, really interesting to me. Incidentally, The idea of it being a progression isn't strictly true. Some people are audio learners, some people are visual learners, some people are kinesthetic learners. Those different learning styles stay with you. I'm very kinesthetic. I learn by doing. If I do something, I've learned it immediately. You can tell me 100 times and it won't sink in. And there are plenty of people like that. But that physical learning in through the bow bath technique is a fine example of how mapping your behaviour starts at the very basic level. And if you think about babies, babies also go through those techniques. They interact in a physical way with their environment first. The other interactions through seeing things, hearing things, talking about things, thinking things through, that kind of stuff, that happens much later after you've got hold of that basic physical interaction. So this isn't a one-way street, this is a two-way street. So let's say we have a situation where you were raised in isolation until you're 20 years old and then you were taken to MIT and chucked in a physics lab. You're not suddenly going to find yourself very creative because you have honed your view to a very narrow view. That's the view you're going to have of the world that you're in, because it's a two-way street. You're creating your environment as well as your environment creating you. What you need to do if you want to do that is open your eyes, and I've said this before, put down the bags, take a deep breath, look at the mountains, that kind of idea. There has to be an act of will in which you want to be receptive to this. If you want to be receptive to these kind of ideas, then you have to play a part in your own environment. So not only do you have to put yourself in a creative environment, you have to make that deliberate effort of will to accept that creativity. Now, we've talked about intelligent creatures, and we can all agree that man is an intelligent creature within limits. But if intelligence is the ability to actively map your behaviour to the contours of the environment, it becomes non-limiting. So not only are creatures, but anything that can exhibit those qualities is intelligent. So we get to the idea of a river. A river, as it flows to the sea, maps its course depending on the environment in which it finds itself. If you change that environment, it will change its course. So a river exhibits a degree of intelligence, as does a rock. A rock will actually walk in the desert because of its contraction and expansion as a response to its environment. All of these things exhibit some degree of intelligence. Now, that might be a bitter pill for people to swallow, but if you think about it and what it actually means, what it means is that the world around us as a totality exhibits intelligence. Intelligence is not something that sits inside your head, not something where we can lift off the top, fish around in the grey matter and find it. Intelligence is an interaction of everything. The whole world exhibits intelligence, and we are, if you like, an expression of that world intelligence. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we can't do anything in isolation. We can't do things by ourselves. We have to do things in the world in which we live. We have to do it in interaction with that world in which we live. That in that world in which we live, our intelligence is directly related to the intelligence of rivers, rocks, cats and bumblebees. It's all one big thing of which we're part. Now, this isn't an idea that is particularly new. It's an idea that's gaining ground. It used to be seen that man was a single individual and he exhibited intelligence, and there was a hierarchy of intelligence and there was a hierarchy of souls. Man had a soul, a cat didn't. Man had intelligence, a cow didn't. If you have that kind of view, then it's quite easy to destroy the world around you because it's all less than you, it's all at your service, it's all something you can abuse, use and cast away. And of course we've had that view for many years and led us to our current problems. It's also one of the reasons why that change is beginning to take place in the way that we see the world. Now no longer seeing the world as isolated from us, that our intelligence, our behaviour, our learning is all a relationship with the world in which we find ourselves. It means that if we want to look after ourselves, we have a duty of care to everything else around us. Looking after ourselves isn't a matter of brushing our teeth, combing our hair and looking after ourselves. It's a matter of looking after everything around you. If you look after everything around you, you are thereby almost automatically looking after yourself. Now, this idea that we have a relationship with everything around us actually goes a little bit deeper than that. It's not only that we have a relationship with everything around us, then if you go back to this idea that what we are is an expression of everything around us, we are a particular expression in this point of time of a whole world that is a thinking thing of which we are an expression, then that relationship means that we are in fact a part of that world. So when you look at a cat and you think, I wonder what it would be like to be a cat, you actually already know because it's there in front of you. There is the cat behaving and acting and thinking like a cat. That is another expression of you. You are already that cat because you are a part of the world. So this idea of the cat might be a bit difficult to swallow, I understand that, but that's only because we've been trained in this conception of me, myself, I. And yet, curiously enough, if we're employed in something where we serve a higher purpose, that is, we work towards a goal that is a shared goal, and this can be anything, and you find it very often in things like churches and actually the railways, where you work for something bigger than yourself. That employment in something bigger than yourself actually gives you a great deal of satisfaction. Now that would be a mystery if it were the little driver in the head, because why is it working hard for something that is beyond you gives you satisfaction? But it does, because it gives you direction. And one of the big bugbears we have in modern Western society is that the kids have no jobs. Because they have no jobs, they have no direction. Because they have no direction and they're being taught about me, myself, I, all they look at is self-satisfaction. So we get drug problems, we get laziness, we get robberies, all that kind of stuff shoots up in that kind of environment because you're looking to serve the self. When you look to serve something bigger than yourself, that is, you're employed in a purpose that is greater than yourselves, you get satisfaction from it, and those kind of figures go down. Now, why would that be the case? Well, it's the case because we know inherently in ourselves that we are part of the world. We have to be taught that we're not. Now, what it also means is you can't actually leave the world. So what then becomes important? Well, if you're an expression of the world and you die, then what really happens is your expression changes. Now, I know that's almost Buddhist in its appeal, if you like, but it also means that you are here forever, and what becomes important is the contribution you make to the environment around you. If you want to make an important contribution, then that contribution is about adding to the world, taking care of it, looking after your fellow creatures. All that sort of stuff then suddenly becomes important, particularly when you're doing something like science, because science is an in-depth investigation of the environment in which we move. Previously, that science has been fairly brutal in its investigations. It's been ripping things apart and seeing how they work in a mechanistic kind of way. Now it's looking at very different things indeed, and it looks at how we can actually work together with the world in which we live in order to get the things that we need in order to improve our lives. And it's become a very, very different paradigm. Now, recently, I got my electricity bill. This may not seem very relevant, but it is. Recently I got my electricity bill, and it turns out I use 27 kilowatt hours throughout the year of electrical energy. And if you think about it, and you think about how much power a kettle takes, it's equivalent to me boiling my kettle for 5 days. That's all the energy I used. It's not a massive amount of energy. But in order to get that energy to me, it took centralised power stations and cost me hundreds of pounds. The reason it's so unimpressive when you look at it like that is because we have a very brutal way of approaching things. We burn oil, we use pretty poor nuclear fusion, we burn coal to get this energy, we raise it up to a massive level, we pump it through wires to the house where there's huge losses. Somebody reported recently in the droughts in the UK that 90% of water was lost in the pipework before it got to you. It's the same with electricity. Most of that energy is being wasted before you get it. And then, of course, you have to pay for it. You have to pay for all that profligate waste, not to mention the cost of the copper. So all of this rapacious way of looking at the world is brutal, inefficient, and expensive. And it's made us come round to think about things like microgeneration, where we put things at the home so we don't have those huge distances to travel. And efficient means of getting energy, means where we work with the environment instead of the environment in order to get the energy requirements that we need. Now, it looks like we burn up a huge amount of energy. Actually, like I say, my energy requirement is 27 kilowatt hours per year. That's piss poor. When I read that, I realised I could actually do that by running a small generator in my garage, and it would be a hell of a lot cheaper, and I'm tempted to do it. In fact, I probably will. Now, all of those considerations bear directly on the philosophy of science, the way that we approach science and the kind of thoughts that we have about it when we approach it. Now, there'll be some people who have watched this to the end and have gone, bah, humbug, that's a load of bollocks, what's that got to do with science? It's got everything to do with science. The way that we approach it is actually formed by our understanding and by our philosophical approach. The results that we get from it are actually directly related to that. What we notice, again, is all part of what we're looking for, and what we're looking for is all part of the way we see the world. Now, science will tell you that they don't do that, that they just look, and if something interesting comes up, they note it down. That is such utter bollocks. If I were to take you and drop you in the middle of the ocean, you certainly would not swim in random circles. You would swim in a specific direction hoping to reach land, and that's how science proceeds. That's why so many things have been invented twice. We all know that Carruthers, when he first invented nylon, tipped it down the sink because it was a failed result of an experiment. It was only later that he came back to it and got nylon, but the first time he actually just threw it away. And that is a common story in science. If it's not what they're looking for, they throw it away. They don't investigate because of the interest in investigation. They investigate because they have a specific goal that they're trying to achieve. That goal is dictated by the philosophy that they have. Can they use it? Can they pull it out? Can they burn it? It's very, very goal-directed and very specific in its philosophy. So how you approach it is very much determined by the philosophical view that you have. So let's sum up a little bit. Learning and intelligence is about the organism adapting and mapping its behaviour to the contours of the environment in which it finds itself. The genes control very, very little. They add to the environment, but it's the environment that has precedent. The genes do contain some information which does add to the environment. That's why the search for the intelligent gene is a complete and utter waste of time. There is no differentiation between the level of intelligence of different people and different creatures. We are all as intelligent as each other because intelligence is the product of the environment in which you find yourself. So there is no differentiation in those terms between intelligence. Philosophy is a key point to understand and adopt, particularly in scientific investigation, because it will direct your efforts and direct how and what you... So the final thing, when you think about all these ideas that I've just been chatting about, it really should be no surprise why I approach things the way I approach them, why I've got the YouTube channel, why I do open source, why I'm trying to be supportive of everybody else, why I think it's important that you do the experiments when you raise questions, not that I do them and answer them for you. All of this stuff should be really obvious because it is actually directly from my philosophy. I don't think I'm different. I think I'm a part of the world in which I find myself. That means I'm really keen for everybody else to be experimenting because that raises the environment up and makes us all part of what's going on. Anyway, that's nearly half an hour of me burbling on, which is quite a lot to take, I guess. Mostly it's about ideas. Mostly it's about sharing stuff. Mostly it's the belief that we all have the same potential within us, and that really, if we're in the right environment, that potential will come forward, and that will move us all upwards. So anyway, I hope it was of some interest, and I hope you enjoyed watching if you watched to the end. And thank you very much.